The night of the harvest social, Cyrus Prescott stood outside the split-rail fence at the edge of the Caldwell property with his hat pulled low, his boots planted in the dry Texas dirt, and absolutely nowhere else to go. The year was 1878, and the town of Redrock, Texas, was the kind of place that formed opinions about a man before he even had the chance to introduce himself. Redrock sat in the flatlands between San Antonio and the hill country, a modest collection of buildings that included a general store, a smithy, a land office, a church painted white that was always peeling, and a saloon called the Dusty Spur that smelled of pine resin and old whiskey. The railroad had passed 20 miles to the north 2 years prior, and while some towns withered from that kind of neglect, Redrock had simply hardened. Its people became more certain of themselves and more suspicious of anyone who challenged that certainty. Cyrus had arrived in Redrock 6 months earlier with a deed to 40 acres of rocky land on the eastern edge of the county, a small inheritance from an uncle he had barely known, and the intention of building something lasting. He was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders, quiet by nature, and had spent the better part of his 20s working cattle drives along the Kishom Trail. He was not a man of many words, but the words he chose were always precise, and the men he had ridden with trusted him without question. He knew how to read weather in the color of a sky, how to calm a spooked horse with nothing but the sound of his voice, and how to fix a wagon wheel in the dark with 2 bad tools and a lot of patience. What he did not know was how to make himself agreeable to a town that had already decided it did not need him. It had started with the land. The 40 acres he inherited had been the subject of a quiet dispute between 2 Redrock families, the Harmons and the Calverts, both of whom had believed for years that the land might eventually come to one of them through various back-channel agreements and handshake deals that existed only in memory. When Cyrus arrived with a proper deed registered in San Antonio, both families concluded that the easiest solution was to dislike him together. And in a town the size of Redrock, those 2 families held enough social weight to ensure that the dislike spread like dust in a dry wind. By the time October arrived and the Caldwell family organized the annual harvest social on their property, a tradition that involved fiddle music, dancing, apple cider, and enough baked goods to fill a barn, Cyrus Prescott had been in town for half a year and had received no invitation. He had known he would not receive one, and he had told himself he did not care. But October evenings in Texas carry a particular sweetness to them, a cooling in the air that feels like permission to want things, and so he had walked out to the edge of the Caldwell property anyway, not to intrude, just to stand at the fence and listen to the fiddle music carry across the dark. He leaned against the fence post and watched the lantern swing from the posts that had been driven into the ground around the dancing area. He could see the couples moving, the women in their good dresses, the men with their hair combed flat. He could smell the wood smoke and the sugar from the cider. He was not a man given to self-pity, but there was something about that evening that sat heavy in his chest, not loneliness exactly, but the specific ache of being close to something warm and not being able to step inside it. He almost did not notice her. She was standing on the far side of the dancing area, pressed back against the fence on the opposite edge, and she was so still that at first he took her for a post or a shadow. But then she shifted slightly, and the lantern light caught the pale fabric of her dress, and he could see that she was a woman standing alone, watching the dancing the same way he was watching it from outside it, from a careful distance, with an expression on her face that he could not yet read but that he recognized without being able to name. He watched her for a long moment. No one approached her. No one invited her to dance. The men who were not yet paired off moved past her as though she were part of the fence itself, and the women who crossed near her path did not stop to speak. She was not invisible. People were aware of her. He could see that much in the brief glances that slid in her direction and then slid away again. But she was excluded in a way that was more deliberate than accidental. He did not think long about it. He picked up his hat from where he had set it on the fence post, settled it back on his head, and walked along the outside of the fence toward her side of the property. The grass was tall and dry out there beyond the fence, and it whispered against his boots as he walked. He moved slowly so as not to startle her, and when he was perhaps 10 feet away he stopped. "Evening," he said. She turned, and he saw her face clearly for the first time. Catherine Langston was 26 years old, with dark hair that she wore pinned up, but that was already beginning to escape its pins in the way that dark hair tends to do on warm evenings. Her eyes were a deep, serious brown, and her expression carried in it something that Cyrus Prescott recognized immediately, because he wore a version of it himself every day, the look of a person who has learned to expect very little from the people around them, and has made peace with that expectation. She was not beautiful in the theatrical, gasping way of some women, but there was something in the architecture of her face, in the steadiness of her gaze, that was more compelling than beauty. She looked like a woman who had thought hard about the world and arrived at conclusions she was willing to defend. She looked at him for a moment with a wariness that was reasonable. "Evening," she said, and her voice was measured, not cold, just careful. "I noticed you were standing over here by yourself," he said. He was not certain this was the right thing to say, but it was the true thing, and he had always found true things easier to say than correct ones. "I noticed the same about you," she replied. He could not help it, he smiled. Something in her expression shifted, not all the way to a smile, but in that direction, like a door that had been unlocked without quite being opened. "Cyrus Prescott," he said, and he extended his hand over the top of the fence rail. She looked at the hand for a moment, then took it. Her grip was firm, which surprised some men, he suspected, though it did not surprise him. "Catherine Langston," she said. He recognized the name because he made it his business to know the names of people in the town he was trying to make his home in, even when that town did not extend him the same courtesy. Catherine Langston was the daughter of the late Robert Langston, who had owned the Redrock General Store until he died of a lung infection 3 winters prior. After his death, the store had passed to Catherine, who was the only surviving member of the Langston family. She had been managing it alone ever since, which was itself a source of the town's complicated feeling about her. A woman running a business, keeping accounts, ordering supplies, extending and collecting credit. It made people in Redrock uneasy in the particular way that competent women sometimes made people uneasy, as though her capability were a judgment on everyone around her. He had bought supplies at her store twice in his months in Redrock, but both times there had been a boy working the counter, a hired hand named Amos who was perhaps 14, and Cyrus had not seen her. "You own the general store," he said. "I do," she said, and there was a slight brace in her voice, a readiness for whatever was going to follow that statement, which in Redrock usually took the form of some politely expressed doubt. "I bought a good pickaxe handle there last March," he said. "It held up well. I've been meaning to say so." She blinked. This was clearly not what she had expected. "Thank you," she said, and the door in her expression came open a little more. "You weren't invited to this either," he said. It was not a question. She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dancing, the fiddle music braiding through the cool night air. "I received an invitation," she said at last. "Mrs. Caldwell is too proper not to send one. But I also received, on the same afternoon, a visit from Margaret Harmon, who suggested that my attendance might make certain guests uncomfortable, given my ongoing dispute with the Harmon family over a credit account." Cyrus felt a slow, familiar anger settle in his chest, the kind that does not burst out of a man but simply sits there like a coal. "The Harmons," he said, "the same. Have opinions about my land as well." "I know," she said. She glanced at him briefly. "I've heard about you, Mr. Prescott. The town has opinions about you." "So I've gathered," he said. "Do you?" It was a direct question, perhaps more direct than was strictly appropriate for a first conversation at the fence line of a party neither of them had been wanted at. But it felt honest, and she seemed like a woman who responded to honesty. She considered him for a moment with those serious brown eyes. I reserve my opinions for people I've actually spoken with, she said. Which makes you the first. The first what? The first person in Redrock to actually speak to me in more than 3 months, she said. She said it plainly, without drama, as though she were reporting a weather condition. The anger in his chest expanded. I'm sorry, he said, and he meant it in the fullest possible way. Don't be, she said. I've gotten used to it. That doesn't mean you should have to. She looked at him again, more carefully this time, as though she were revising an assessment. No, she said after a moment. I suppose it doesn't. They stood there on either side of the fence in companionable silence for a while, listening to the fiddle music and watching the lanterns swing. The night was deep and full of stars, the Texas sky being one of the few things in Redrock that offered itself without reservation. After a time, Cyrus noted that the wood of the fence rail between them was worn smooth with use, as though many hands had rested there over the years, and he found himself thinking that there were worse places to stand than at the border of a thing you had not been invited into, if the right person was standing there too. Miss Langston, he said eventually. Mr. Prescott. I don't know how to dance, he said. Never learned properly, but if there were a place to learn, I'd want to try. She looked at the dancing again. The fiddler had shifted to a slower tune, and several couples were moving in close, swaying in that loose, earnest way of people who are not trained dancers but who are following something older than training. I know how to dance, she said quietly. My mother taught me when I was a girl. I haven't danced in a very long time. That seems like a waste, he said. She turned to look at him fully, and there was a warmth in her expression now that had not been there when he first walked up, something that was not yet the full heat of feeling but was its early light, like the sky just before the sun clears the horizon. Are you suggesting something, Mr. Prescott? She asked. I'm not suggesting anything, he said. I'm only noting that two people who know approximately one dance between them and have nowhere in particular to be might find something useful to do with an October evening. The corner of her mouth curved. It was not a full smile, but it was real, and it was the most beautiful thing Cyrus Prescott had seen in a long time. The ground out here is uneven, she said. I've danced on worse, he said, which was not entirely true, but he was willing to commit to it. She looked at him for one more moment, weighing something, and then she stepped through the gap in the fence where one of the rails had been removed and not yet replaced, and she came to stand on the same side of it that he was on. They were both outside the party. They were both in the dark. The fiddle music drifted to them like smoke. He held out his hand. She took it. He was not a good dancer. He had not been lying about that. But he was careful, and he was attentive, and he followed her lead with the quiet willingness of a man who had no pride about learning things. She guided him through the slow rhythm of the tune, her hand light in his, and they moved through the tall, dry grass in the dark while the lanterns burned 50 yards away and nobody noticed them at all. This was perhaps the truest thing about that first night. Nobody noticed them. They were invisible out there at the edge of things, two people who had fallen out of the social order in different ways and found themselves on the same side of the fence. But standing there, moving in that careful, halting almost dance through the October dark, Cyrus Prescott felt more seen than he had in 6 months. He thought Catherine Langston might have felt it too, because when the music ended and they stepped apart, she kept her eyes down for a moment in the way that people do when they are feeling something they have not yet prepared words for. Thank you, she said at last. Miss Langston, he said. She looked up. Would you do me the honor of having supper with me sometime, he asked. She was quiet. He could see her thinking about it, turning the offer over, examining the angles of it. Supper, she repeated. Supper, he confirmed. At the hotel dining room, where anyone who wishes to have an opinion about it is free to do so in plain sight. She searched his face, and he let her search it because he had nothing there to hide. Thursday, she said. I close the store at 6 on Thursdays. I'll be at the hotel dining room at 6:30, he said. She nodded once, and then she stepped back through the gap in the fence, and he watched her walk along the edge of the property back toward the road where presumably her wagon was waiting, and he stood there in the dark for a long while after she was gone, with the fiddle music playing and the stars burning overhead, feeling something in his chest that was entirely unfamiliar and entirely welcome. Thursday came around slowly. Cyrus spent the days between the social and the Thursday supper doing the work of a man building something from the ground up. His 40 acres were rocky and difficult, but not hopeless. He had spent the summer clearing brush and patching the old cabin that sat on the property, a structure that had been built perhaps 15 years prior and had been slowly losing its argument with time. He had replaced 2 walls and shored up the roof, and now in October, with the nights cooling, he was working on digging a proper well, because the small creek that ran through the eastern edge of the land was unreliable in dry seasons, and he was a man who thought about the future. He thought about Catherine Langston more than he intended to. He thought about the way she had said his name at the fence, measured and unimpressed but not unkind. He thought about her hand in his, and the way she had guided him through that stumbling dance with a patience that felt like more than manners. He thought about the fact that she had been standing alone at that fence for what he guessed was the better part of 3 hours, and nobody had gone to her, and she had stayed anyway because she had wanted to hear the music, and he found this both heartbreaking and admirable in equal measure. He did not know the full details of her situation yet, only the broad strokes he had collected from 6 months of quiet observation, but he intended to learn if she would let him. On Thursday morning, he put on his cleanest shirt, which was blue and had been mended twice at the cuffs, and he brushed his hat, and he stopped at the smithy on his way into town because he had arranged to have a hinge repaired for his cabin door. The smithy was run by a man named Elihu Grant, a broad, dark-skinned man of about 50 who had come to Texas from Georgia 20 years prior, and who had built the best smithy between San Antonio and Waco through sheer skill and stubbornness. Elihu was one of the few people in Redrock who had offered Cyrus anything approaching friendliness, though it was a guarded, watchful friendliness, the kind extended by a man who had learned a long time ago that trust was something you built slowly or you built wrong. Elihu had the hinge ready and wrapped in cloth, and when Cyrus paid him, the older man looked at him with a slight narrowing of the eyes that might have been amusement. "You're going somewhere tonight," Elihu said. It was not a question. "Hotel dining room," Cyrus said, "with someone." "Miss Langston from the general store," Cyrus said. Elihu was quiet for a moment. He set down the hammer he had been holding and looked at Cyrus with a careful expression. "Catherine Langston is a good woman," he said. "Smart, honest, too honest for most people's comfort." "I don't mind honest," Cyrus said. "No," said Elihu. "I don't suppose you do." He picked up his hammer again. "You watch yourself with the Harmons. They don't like her and they don't like you, and 2 people they don't like taking supper together is going to be the kind of thing they notice." "Let them notice," Cyrus said. Elihu gave him a long look. Then he nodded once slowly in a way that might have meant approval. Cyrus rode into town and left his horse at the livery, and at 6:30 he walked into the hotel dining room, which was a long, bright space with 4 tables covered in checked cloth and a window that looked out on the main street. Mrs. Porter, who ran the hotel with her husband, showed him to a table and brought him a cup of coffee, and at 20 minutes before 7, Catherine Langston walked through the door. She had let her hair down slightly, pinned it differently, in a softer arrangement that made her look less businesslike and more like the person she might be when the store was closed and nobody was watching. She wore a deep burgundy dress that Cyrus suspected was her best one, though it was plain by some standards, plain and good, the way things are when they are made to last and not to impress. She carried herself straight, with that same quality of careful reserve, but when she spotted him at the table and their eyes met, she allowed herself a small, genuine smile, and Cyrus stood up from his chair so quickly that he nearly knocked over his coffee. "Mr. Prescott," she said, settling into the chair across from him. "Miss Langston," he said, "you look well." "You're kind to say so," she said. She folded her hands on the table. "And you look considerably less like a fence post than you did on Saturday." He stared at her for a moment. Then he laughed, a real, full laugh, the kind he had not managed in quite some time, and her small smile grew into something larger and more real. They talked through supper the way that two people talk when they have been starving for genuine conversation, quickly at first, then more slowly as they settled into the ease of it. He told her about the 40 acres and his plans for them, the well he was digging, the cabin he was repairing, the idea he had about keeping a small herd, nothing as ambitious as the big ranches to the south, but something sustainable, something that was his. She listened with a focused attention that was not performative, asked questions that were specific and useful, and he could see her mind working behind her eyes, turning over what he said, connecting it to things she knew. She told him about the store. Her father had built it from nothing 20 years prior, and when he died it had been $6,000 in debt and struggling, because Robert Langston had been a good man and a bad businessman, a generous extender of credit with a poor memory for collecting it. Catherine had inherited not just the store but its obligations, and she had spent 3 years quietly, methodically pulling it back to solvency. She now had it running cleanly, carrying the right inventory, keeping careful accounts. She was not getting rich, but she was getting free of the debt, and she expected to clear it entirely within 2 more years. "The Harmons owe you money," Cyrus said. He had figured this much from what she had told him at the fence. $14.60, she said, and she said it with the particular precision of a woman who has been watching that number not decrease for a very long time. "They were a regular credit account of my father's. I have the ledger entries. When I began collecting outstanding debts 3 years ago, Mr. Harmon told me that the debt was a personal matter between him and my father and did not transfer to me." "That's not how debt works," Cyrus said. "No," she agreed. "It isn't. I wrote to a lawyer in San Antonio. He confirmed I was correct. I sent a formal letter to the Harmons citing the relevant statutes. This was 18 months ago." She paused. "They have not spoken to me since, except to suggest, through intermediaries, that I am a disagreeable woman who is making trouble for a family that has done nothing but try to honor the memory of my father." The slow coal of anger in Cyrus's chest glowed brighter. "Your father's memory would be better honored by paying what he was owed," he said. "That is my feeling as well," she said. They looked at each other across the checked tablecloth, and something passed between them that was not quite spoken but was fully understood, a mutual recognition of something, the sense that here was a person who organized the world by the same principles, who drew the line in the same place. "I intend to resolve my dispute with the Harmons through legal means," he said. "I've been corresponding with the land office in Austin. My deed is clean. I just need patience and documentation. Those are skills I understand," she said. "I imagine they are, Mrs. Porter brought their food, which was a serviceable beef stew and fresh bread, and they ate and talked, and the evening stretched past 8 o'clock, and then toward 9 without either of them noticing. They talked about the things that people talk about when they are genuinely interested in each other, not just the facts of their lives, but the meaning they had made of those facts. She told him about growing up in the store, learning to read inventory, watching her father weigh flour and make change for people who came in from 50 miles away because Redrock was the nearest supply. She had loved it as a child, the sense of being the place where things came together, the center of the web. She had not anticipated inheriting it under these circumstances, at 23 alone. He told her about the cattle drives, about the years of moving, never staying, always pushing north or south along the trail with the same rhythm. He had been good at it but had never loved it. What he had loved was the land itself, the particular way that Texas land looked in the early morning when the light first touched it, that copper-gold quality that made everything look both ancient and new. He had wanted something of his own for a long time, and you chose Redrock, she said. My uncle chose it for me, he said, but I've decided to agree with him, even with the Harmons. Especially with the Harmons, he said. I'm not built for running away from a thing. She regarded him steadily. "Neither am I," she said. When they left the hotel dining room, he walked her to her wagon, which was tied at the rail outside the general store. The night was cool and very still, the same October sky overhead that had held them at the fence 4 days ago. "Thank you for supper, Mr. Prescott," she said, gathering her reins. "Thank you for the company, Miss Langston," he said. He paused. "May I call on you again?" She considered this in the way that she seemed to consider everything, not hesitantly, but with genuine deliberateness, as though she were consulting something internal that she trusted more than convention. "You may come to the store on Saturday morning," she said. "I'm usually doing the week's ordering between 8 and 10. If you wanted to help, you'd be welcome to." It was not exactly a romantic invitation. It was better than one. She was inviting him into the actual fabric of her life, into the working hour of it, the unglamorous ordinary portion. He understood what she was offering. "I'll be there at 8, he said. She drove away into the dark, and he walked to the livery to get his horse, and he rode home across the flat October land with the stars burning and the dry grass whispering, and he felt something in him settle, like ground that has been shaken and has finally gone quiet. Saturday came, and he was at the store at 8 o'clock. She was already behind the counter with her ledger open and a pencil behind her ear and a cup of coffee steaming at her elbow, and she looked up when he came in the way you look up when you have been expecting someone and are glad they arrived. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning, Miss Langston," he said. He looked around the store, which was well organized, its shelves neat and fully stocked, the flour and sugar barrels solid along the back wall, the hardware section clean and properly labeled. "What needs doing?" "I'm taking stock of the dry goods," she said. "If you can count the coffee tins on the top shelf and write down the number, that saves me getting the stepladder." He counted coffee tins. He counted them and he wrote down the number, and he handed her the paper, and she entered it in the ledger with precise, small handwriting. And this went on for 2 hours, the two of them moving through the store in a kind of quiet, purposeful tandem. And it was the most comfortable 2 hours Cyrus Prescott had spent in Redrock, possibly in longer than that. Around 10 o'clock, Amos came in to mind the counter, and Catherine made a second pot of coffee, and she and Cyrus sat on the front steps of the store in the thin October sunshine and drank it together. "My father used to do the Saturday ordering," she said, turning her cup in her hands. "I used to sit on these same steps and watch the street. On Saturday mornings all the ranch families came in for supplies and the street was always full." She looked at the street, which was moderately busy but not full. "It's different now." "Different how?" he asked. "Fewer families," she said. "Some ranches have been sold. Some people moved north toward the railroad. The town is smaller than it was when I was a girl." She paused. "I wonder sometimes if it will go on shrinking until there's nothing left." "Towns don't die as easily as people think," he said. "Not if they have something worth staying for." She glanced at him sideways. "And what does Redrock have worth staying for?" "Good land," he said. "Reasonable water. A general store with honest accounts." He paused. "Decent coffee." She smiled into her cup. "Flattery, Mr. Prescott." "Observation," he said. They sat there in the morning sun, and the street went about its business, and Cyrus was aware of the looks that came their way, not hostile exactly, but curious, noting the way a small town notes things that are new. He did not look at the looks. He looked at the street, and at his coffee, and at Catherine Langston beside him, and he thought that he could sit on these steps for a great many more Saturdays without exhausting the experience. The weeks that followed settled into a pattern that felt both new and deeply familiar, the way certain rhythms do when they are the right ones. Cyrus came to the store on Saturday mornings. They took supper at the hotel on Thursday evenings. In between, he worked his land and she worked the store, and they did not see each other, but they knew that they would. And knowing this changed the quality of the days in between in a way that Cyrus recognized but had never experienced before. He acknowledged to himself on a cold November morning while shoring up the posts of the fence along his eastern boundary, falling in love with Catherine Langston. He recognized it the way he recognized weather coming in off the plains, not with alarm but with a kind of accepting attentiveness. There it is. That's what this is. He thought about the best way to proceed. He was not an impulsive man. He understood that Catherine had built something careful around herself, a structure of self-sufficiency and guarded expectation, and that this structure had been built as protection against a world that had repeatedly failed to take her seriously. He did not want to force anything. He wanted to earn it. He was not the only one thinking carefully, he suspected. In November, the Harmon situation flared up. It happened on a Wednesday morning when Cyrus was in town to file some papers at the land office. He was crossing the main street when he heard raised voices from the direction of the general store, and he changed direction without thinking about it. When he reached the store, he found Frank Harmon standing at the counter, a heavy man in his 50s with a red face, and a habit of placing his hands flat on surfaces to suggest ownership, and Catherine behind the counter with her account ledger open and her expression completely composed, which Cyrus had come to understand was the look she wore when she was at the end of her patience but had decided not to show it. A matter that was settled between your father and mine, and you coming in here with your little book doesn't change what was agreed between gentlemen, Harmon was saying. There was no formal agreement, Catherine said, her voice level. There is a ledger entry. The entry represents a debt. The debt is still outstanding. That is the complete situation, Mr. Harmon. My father was a friend of your father's, yes, she said. And my father extended your family credit in friendship, which makes the failure to repay it more remarkable, not less. Harmon's face went deeper red. He leaned forward on the counter. You are a difficult woman, he said, in the tone men use when they mean to wound. I am an accurate one, she said. Cyrus stepped through the door. He did not say anything at first. He simply came in and stood with his hands easy at his sides and looked at Frank Harmon, who turned and looked back at him with the expression of a man who has been interrupted in something he considered private. Prescott, Harmon said. Harmon, Cyrus said. He looked at Catherine. Everything all right, Miss Langston? Quite all right, she said, though her eyes held a brief flicker of gratitude. This doesn't concern you, Harmon said. I'm a customer of this establishment, Cyrus said. Miss Langston's business is conducted properly and she deserves to conduct it without harassment. That concerns me. Harmon stared at him for a long moment, his jaw working. You two deserve each other, he said finally, with the particular viciousness of a man who has no better argument. I consider that a compliment, Cyrus said. Harmon picked up his hat from the counter and walked out of the store, and the door swung shut behind him, and the silence that followed was full and clean. Catherine let out a long, slow breath. Then she looked at Cyrus across the counter, and her expression was complicated gratitude and something else, something more guarded. You didn't need to do that, she said. No, he agreed. I didn't need to. She looked at him for a moment. Then very quietly she said, thank you. He nodded. He bought a pound of coffee, which he did not actually need, and he went back out onto the street, and he felt the warmth of having done the right thing mixing with the warmth of something else that was harder to name but no less real. The following Thursday, supper was different. They had been at the hotel dining room long enough that Mrs. Porter had started bringing their coffee without being asked, and on this particular Thursday evening, as the November wind pushed against the dining room windows, Catherine told him something she had not told anyone in Redrock. I was engaged once, she said without preamble in that direct way she had. He put his coffee down. He looked at her. 5 years ago, she said, before my father died, a man named Thomas Ellie from San Antonio. He was a banker's son. We were engaged for 8 months. She paused. When my father died and I inherited the debt of the store, he decided that the situation was not what he had anticipated and ended the engagement. Cyrus held very still. He told me that a woman managing a business in that kind of trouble was not a suitable match for his family's expectations, she said. She said it evenly, as she said most things, but he could hear underneath the evenness something that had been a long time bleeding. He was wrong, Cyrus said, about the store and about you. I know that, she said. I knew it then. That didn't make it less painful. She looked at him steadily. I'm telling you because I want you to understand why I'm careful." "I understand," he said. "Do you?" she said. "I understand that someone you trusted and who was supposed to choose you decided you were too much work when the circumstances changed," he said. "And I understand that after something like that, a person builds better fences." She held his gaze for a long moment. Something in her expression was raw in a way she usually didn't allow. "Yes," she said softly, "that's about right." "Catherine," he said. He had not used her first name before. It came out quietly without fanfare, but it landed and he could see it land. "I'm not Thomas Ellie. I know you have no reason to believe that except time and evidence, and I'm not asking you to believe it before the evidence is there. I'm only asking you to let me provide it." She looked at him for a long time across the checked tablecloth, with the November wind outside and the lanterns burning and the sound of the fiddler at the dusty spur drifting faintly from 2 streets over. "All right," she said at last. "That seems reasonable." They looked at each other, and the warmth between them had shifted into something more serious, more deliberate, something that knew its own name now and was not pretending otherwise. December came to Redrock with a cold snap that froze the shallow puddles in the street and turned the morning sky a shade of pale silver that Cyrus loved. He finished the well-hit good water at 30 feet, which was better than he had expected, and began work on extending the cabin, adding a room to the south side that would eventually serve as a proper kitchen and living area, larger and better insulated than the original single room. He had plans for the spring planting season, had already ordered seed from a catalog, was in correspondence with a man in Careville about purchasing a small starter herd of longhorns. He was building for something, and he was aware of building for something, and the thing he was building for had dark hair and precise handwriting, and a way of looking at him that made him feel both seen and steadied. On a Saturday in mid-December, after the morning's work at the store, they walked together along the road that ran east out of Redrock toward the flat country, the same direction as his land. The day was cold but bright, the sky enormous and cloudless, the dry grass catching the light and turning it gold. He had brought an extra coat from his saddlebag and had offered it to her when she shivered once, and she had taken it without pretending she didn't need it, which he appreciated. They walked and they talked, and after a while the talking gave way to easy silence, the kind that only happens between people who have stopped performing for each other. "I want to show you something," he said, and he led her down a gentle slope to the creek that ran along the eastern edge of his property, and they stood on the bank and looked at the water, which was running clear and cold over pale limestone. "This is the edge of your land?" she asked. "That fence line up the hill," he said, pointing. She looked. She was quiet for a moment, taking it in. "It's good land," she said. "It is," he agreed. "Rocky but good. The creek's reliable in most years." "What will you do with it?" He told her his plan: the small herd, the winter wheat in the south field, the kitchen garden close to the cabin, the possibility of a peach orchard on the limestone ridge to the northwest, which had the right exposure for it. He talked about it with the unself-conscious specificity of a man describing something he has thought about for a long time, and she listened with that focused quality she had, asking a question here and there, her mind obviously running alongside the picture he was painting. "You've thought about this carefully," she said. "I've had a long time to think about it," he said. "All those years on the trail, moving through country I didn't own, I used to think about what it would be like to stay in one place long enough to see the same tree in every season." He looked at the creek. "I want to know a piece of land the way you know a person, all its moods." She was very still beside him. "That's a beautiful way to put it," she said quietly. He looked at her. She was looking at the creek, and the winter light was on her face, and there was something in her expression that was open and unguarded in a way he had not seen before, as though the landscape or the cold or the honesty of the conversation had brought her to a place where the careful reserve she carried had briefly released. He wanted to say something. He wanted to say several things. He settled on the truest one. "I'd like you to see it in all its seasons, too," he said. She turned to look at him. She understood what he was saying. He could see that she understood. "Cyrus," she said, and his name in her mouth was different from how anyone else said it, had a specific weight and warmth to it. "I'm not rushing anything," he said. "I only want you to know the direction I'm moving in." She held his gaze for a long moment, and then she reached out and took his hand, not in the formal way she had taken it at the fence in October, but quietly, naturally, her fingers threading through his, and they stood there by the cold creek on his land in the December sun and held on to each other. "I know the direction," she said. "I'm not running from it." This was, Cyrus Prescott knew, the closest thing to a declaration he was likely to get from Catherine Langston for a while, and it was entirely enough. January brought the resolution of the Harmon land dispute, or at least the legal portion of it. The land office in Austin confirmed in a formal letter what Cyrus's deed had always said. The 40 acres were his, the claim was clean, and no prior informal arrangement had any legal standing. The Harmons received a copy of this letter, and a quiet descended from that direction, a sullen retreat rather than an acceptance, but Cyrus could work with silence. What mattered was that the matter was settled. Elihu Grant at the smithy heard about the letter and nodded when Cyrus told him. "Good," Elihu said simply. "Now they can be unhappy about something else." "Do you think they'll cause more trouble?" Cyrus asked. "Not the kind that matters," Elihu said. "The Harmons are the kind of people who fight loudest when they think they can win. They don't have the stomach for a real fight once the law is against them." He looked at Cyrus. "You and Miss Langston are getting on well." "We are," Cyrus said. "She needs someone who won't run when things get hard," Elihu said, returning to his work. "Her father was a good man, but he ran from the hard things, bills, debts, decisions he should have made earlier. She's had to be the strong one her whole life. She needs someone who can be strong alongside her, not instead of her." Cyrus thought about this. "I understand the difference," he said. Elihu looked up. "I believe you do," he said, which from Elihu was as strong an endorsement as you were likely to receive. February was when Catherine Langston's debts fully cleared. She did not announce it publicly. She did not make a scene. She simply appeared at the hotel dining room on Thursday evening with a brightness in her eyes that was different from usual, and when he asked her how her day had been, she told him that she had made the final payment on her father's outstanding debt to the San Antonio supply house that had been her largest creditor. "It's done," she said. 3 years and 2 months. It's done." Cyrus reached across the table and took her hand. "Congratulations," he said. "Your father would be proud." She looked at their joined hands on the table. This was the first time they had done this in public, and he watched her consider it, the visibility of it, the town's eyes, the implications, and then watched her decide consciously to leave her hand where it was. "I think he would be relieved," she said. "He was a man with many regrets about the way he managed things. I hope he's had some peace about it wherever he is." "Tell me about him," Cyrus said. So she did. She talked about Robert Langston, the way adult children talk about parents who were complicated in their love, with clear eyes for the flaws and genuine warmth for the good. He had been a storyteller, she said, a wonderful storyteller, and the store had always been full of his stories, and she had grown up believing that the best thing a person could do was make a place where people felt welcome and heard. He had just been better at the warmth than at the accounting, and the accounting had caught up with him. "You got his warmth and added the accounting," Cyrus said. She looked at him. "You think I'm warm?" "Under the ledger entries," he said. "Yes." She laughed, and it was not the small, careful, almost smile he had first seen at the fence, but a full, real laugh surprised out of her, and the sound of it traveled through him like the first warm day after a long winter. March was when he asked her properly. He had spent February thinking about how. He was not a man for grand gestures or theatrical presentations, and he knew that Catherine would not want them, would, in fact, find them suspect, as though grand gestures were compensation for something that was not actually solid. She wanted the thing itself, not the display of it. He had come to understand this thoroughly. He asked her on a Saturday morning in late March, on the front steps of the store with their coffee, when the spring had just barely arrived and the air was that particular combination of warm sun and cool breeze that makes everything feel possible. He simply said it. "Catherine, I'd like to marry you if you'll have me." She held her coffee cup in both hands and looked at the street. He watched her profile and he did not rush her. "You're certain," she said. It was not a question exactly. "I've been certain since October," he said. "I've just been waiting until you were ready to hear it." She looked at him then and her eyes were bright, not with tears exactly but with something full and real. "I'll want to keep the store," she said. "I know," he said. "I'd never ask you not to. And I'll want to manage my own accounts, both the stores and our households." "That seems sensible," he said. "You're better at it than I am." "I'm not easy," she said. "I've been told I'm difficult, that I'm too precise, too direct, too—" "Catherine," he said quietly. She stopped. "I know who you are," he said. "I've been paying attention since October. I'm not asking you to be different. I'm asking you as you are." Her chin lifted slightly, and she was fighting something in her face, and then she stopped fighting it. "Yes," she said. "My answer is yes." He reached over and took her hand on the steps, and the morning sun was on them both, and the street went about its business, and Amos came to the store window, saw them on the steps, and immediately disappeared again, probably to share the news, because news in Redrock traveled on the same wind as dust. They were married in April, in the white-painted church that was always pealing, by a Reverend Mullins, who was a small, earnest man with an impressive mustache and a genuine warmth for his congregation, even for the members of it who did not attend services as regularly as he might wish. The wedding was not large. Elihu Grant came, dressed in a good suit that he wore with the dignity of a man who had earned every inch of what he wore. Amos came, scrubbed and wide-eyed. Mrs. Porter from the hotel came, and brought a cake she had baked, and wept quietly through the vows in the way that kind women sometimes do at weddings, not from sadness, but from an excessive feeling for the rightness of things. A handful of other townspeople attended, most of them the ones who had, over the months since October, quietly revised their opinions of both Cyrus and Catherine, as they watched two people behave with consistent honesty and dignity in the face of consistent small-town resistance. Frank Harmon did not attend, and his absence was a gift. The ceremony itself was brief but not shallow. Reverend Mullins spoke about the nature of partnership and the specific courage required to build a life alongside another person, and Cyrus stood at the front of that peeling white church and looked at Catherine coming down the aisle in a dress of pale blue that she had made herself over the winter evenings, her dark hair pinned up and threatening its usual escape from its pins, and he felt something settle in him that was so deep and so complete that it was past the reach of language. She reached him and looked up at him, and he could see the fullness of her feeling in her eyes, that careful, intelligent, fiercely private woman letting him see all of it, and he thought that this was the greatest trust she had ever extended to any person, and he was determined to deserve it for the rest of his life. They said the words. He put a plain gold ring on her finger that he had made by a jeweler in San Antonio at a cost that represented 3 months of careful saving. She looked at it on her hand, with an expression of such tender seriousness that Mrs. Porter had to press her handkerchief harder against her eyes. After the ceremony, there was a small celebration in the churchyard, and someone produced a fiddle, and Mrs. Porter cut the cake, and Elihu Grant made a toast in his measured, sonorous voice that was short and true and entirely sufficient, and the afternoon light fell gold across the churchyard and the peeling paint of the church and the faces of the people gathered there, and Catherine Langston, Catherine Prescott now, though she chose to keep both names professionally, stood beside her husband with her hand in his and her chin lifted and her eyes bright, and she looked like a woman who had arrived somewhere she intended to stay. Later, after the guests had gone, as the April evening came down cool and violet over Redrock, Cyrus and Catherine stood together in the churchyard in the last of the light, alone, the way you are alone after a wedding when the crowd has dispersed, and the weight of the celebration falls away, and there's just the two of you, and the fact of what you've done. She leaned against him, her shoulder against his chest, and he put his arm around her, and they stood like that in the churchyard while the first stars appeared. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "I'm thinking about a fence," she said. He smiled. He knew which fence. "Me too," he said. "I'm thinking about how I almost didn't go to that social at all," she said. "I had decided the afternoon beforehand that it wasn't worth the indignity, and then I changed my mind because I wanted to hear the music." "I'm glad you changed your mind," he said. "I'm glad you walked along the fence," she said. She turned her head slightly so her cheek rested against him. "Nobody else did. Nobody else had my incentive," he said. She was quiet again, and then she said very softly, "I thought I had made my peace with alone. I was quite good at alone. I had organized it very efficiently." "You had," he agreed. "It turns out," she said, "that I prefer this." He tightened his arm around her. "So do I," he said. "Considerably." The spring unfolded across Cyrus's 40 acres with the generous abundance that Texas land sometimes offers when the winter has been cold enough and the water has been right. The winter wheat came up strong in the south field, green and thick in the morning light, and the kitchen garden beside the cabin pushed up spinach and early onions, and the first hopeful signs of the tomato seedlings Catherine had started in tins on the windowsill in March. The creek ran well through April and into May, and the new room on the south side of the cabin was finished by the first week of May, larger than the original structure, with good windows and a proper stove that Elihu Grant had helped him set, and a table big enough for 2 people to sit at on either side with room between them for a lamp and a coffee pot. Catherine came to the cabin on Saturday afternoons after closing the store, riding out on the road east of town on the good bay mare she kept at the livery, and she would come through the door with the look of someone putting down a considerable weight, and he would have coffee ready, and they would sit at the table in the new kitchen, and she would tell him about the week's business, and he would tell her about the week's work, and the cabin that had been a lonely, too quiet place would fill up with the particular sound of 2 people talking because they want to, not because they have to. The first night she stayed, rather than riding back to town, was in late May, and it was not a planned thing but a natural evolution, because the evening had stretched long with talking, and the supper was good, and the night outside was a deep and gentle dark full of frogs singing from the creek, and it seemed like the most obvious thing in the world that she should simply stay in the home that was as much hers as his. And they sat on the porch they had built along the south side of the cabin, and watched the stars come out, and listened to the frogs and drank coffee that had gone cold, but that neither of them noticed. In June, Catherine moved the store's account books to the cabin for the summer, which meant she was riding out to the land 3 or 4 days a week to work on them in the new kitchen, while Cyrus worked the fields, and the arrangement suited them both in the way that the best practical arrangements do, not because they required each other's constant presence, but because the proximity of the other person made the work feel easier and better and worth doing. Summer in Texas is not a gentle season, and the heat in July was serious, the kind that sits on the land like a hand pressing down, and Cyrus worked in the early mornings and the late evenings and rested through the afternoon hours. He had bought his starter herd in June 12 longhorns from a rancher in Careville, good stock, a mix of young cows and 2 yearling bulls, and the herd required attention and care in the heat, checking the water trough, watching for illness, keeping them in the shade of the limestone ridge on the worst days. Catherine took to the cattle with an interest that surprised him, and then, on reflection, did not surprise him at all, because Catherine Langston took an interest in everything with structure and purpose. She learned their individual personalities quickly. The oldest cow, a broad, placid animal she named Margaret with a dry wit that Cyrus appreciated, and she kept notes on their condition in the back pages of one of her ledgers, which he found both charming and entirely practical. In August, on a hot evening after supper, they were sitting on the porch watching the heat lightning flicker over the southern horizon, and Catherine said without looking at him, "I think I'm expecting a child." The heat lightning flickered. The frogs were quiet in the dry season creek. He turned to look at her. She was looking at the horizon and her profile was still and serious, and he could see that she was holding herself carefully, not certain how he would receive this. "Catherine," he said. She turned to look at him. "Are you frightened?" he asked. She considered this honestly. "Some," she said. "Are you?" "Some," he said. He reached over and took her hand. "Are you happy about it?" She looked at him for a long moment, and then the careful reserve gave way, and she smiled fully, openly, without reservation, the way she had smiled that first time at the hotel dining room when he had made her laugh, but bigger, deeper, something that was coming from the very center of her. "Yes," she said. "I am very happy about it." "Then I am too," he said. "Considerably." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and the heat lightning flickered over the southern Texas sky, and the frogs started up again down at the creek, and Cyrus Prescott sat on the porch of the home he had built and held his wife's hand in the August dark and felt, with a completeness that required no qualification, that everything was exactly right. He rode to Elihu Grant's smithy the next morning and told him, because Elihu was the nearest thing he had to family in Redrock, and it seemed right. Elihu listened, and then he put down his hammer and he held out his hand, and when Cyrus shook it, Elihu held the grip for a moment and looked at him steadily. "Take good care of her," Elihu said. "She's worked hard to get to happy." "I know it," Cyrus said. "Good," said Elihu. He picked up his hammer. "Come back and tell me when it arrives." The baby was born in April, on a morning that was cool and clear and smelled of new grass and the creek running full with spring water. Cyrus had ridden for the doctor in the middle of the night, a Dr. Waverly who was new to Redrock and earnest and competent, and Mrs. Porter had come out from town as well, not because anyone asked her but because she had heard and come, which was the way she was, and Cyrus was grateful for it. The baby was a boy. He was born just after dawn, as the first light was coming through the east window of the cabin and laying itself across the whitewashed wall, and when Cyrus first held him, he was struck by the absolute specificity of him, the particular small face that was already its own face, not a version of anything else but itself. He looked at Catherine, who was lying in the bed with the exhaustion of someone who has done the hardest work there is, and her eyes were bright and her hair was loose, and she looked at their son with an expression of such complete and luminous love that it became the most beautiful thing Cyrus had ever seen, which was considerable because he had seen a great many beautiful things in his 32 years. "He's perfect," he said, which was both the most insufficient and most complete thing he could think to say. "He is," she agreed. "What shall we call him?" She looked at the baby and then at Cyrus and then back at the baby. "Robert," she said, "for my father." "Robert Prescott," he said, tasting the name. "Robert Cyrus Prescott," she said. He looked at her. "If that suits you," she said. It suited him completely. He did not say so in words. He sat down on the edge of the bed and she leaned against him with the baby between them. And the April morning came through the window and laid its light across all three of them. And out past the window the winter wheat was already up green in the south field, and the creek was singing, and the longhorns were moving slow and peaceful along the ridge. The first year of Robert Cyrus Prescott's life was the fullest year of his father's, and the fullest year of his mother's, which was saying something, because both of them had already had full lives. He was a solid, curious, contented baby, dark-haired like his mother but with his father's steady gray eyes, and he observed the world around him with a seriousness that made both his parents laugh. Catherine managed the store and the accounts, and the baby with a competence that would have not surprised anyone who knew her. But what surprised them, and what pleased Cyrus most to witness, was how the arrival of Robert seemed to open something in her that had been very carefully closed. The efficient reserve that was her public face began to have more give in it, more easy warmth. She laughed more readily. She was slower to assume the worst of people's intentions. The scar that Thomas Ellie had left had not disappeared, it was still there. He could see it sometimes in the careful way she assessed new situations, but it was healed over, and over it was growing something better. Redrock itself changed some in the first years of Cyrus and Catherine's life together, as towns do when the people in them shift their shape. The Harmons did not leave, but they diminished in their influence, as families tend to do when their social position is no longer unchallenged, and when their moral authority turns out to be based more on social pressure than on actual good conduct. Frank Harmon paid the $14.60 to Catherine in the fall of 1879, without acknowledgement or apology, simply leaving an envelope on the store counter and walking out. Catherine entered it in the ledger and closed the account and said nothing about it to anyone except Cyrus, who said that it was the most begrudging payment he had ever heard of. "It closed the account," Catherine said. "That's all I required." New families came to Redrock as the decade turned toward the 1880s, drawn by the cheap land and the relative order of the place, and some of them had never formed any opinion about Catherine or Cyrus at all, and simply met them as they were. An honest, capable woman who ran the general store with more accuracy and more fair dealing than most operations in the county, and a quiet, hard-working man whose land was producing well, and whose cattle had grown to a herd of 28, and whose reputation for keeping his word was absolute. Elihu Grant remained their closest friend. He took to Robert Cyrus Prescott with a gravity and tenderness that Cyrus found deeply moving, and he was the person to whom Robert said his first word, which was a disputed matter, but Cyrus was fairly certain it was Eli, produced on a Saturday morning at the smithy, while the old man was showing the boy the way a fire takes hold in a forge. Elihu had gone very still at the sound of it, and then he had looked at the baby with an expression that was private and enormous. "You'll teach him the forge when he's older," Cyrus said. "If he wants to learn," Elihu said, "a man should know how metal works." "A man should know a great many things," Catherine said, from where she was standing in the smithy doorway with a cup of coffee, watching them. "He'll have time." In the winter of 1880, Catherine told Cyrus she was expecting again, and this time there was no careful holding herself, no uncertainty about how he would respond. She told him over supper with the matter-of-fact brightness of a woman who is entirely secure in her own life, and he looked up from his plate and grinned at her, and she grinned back, and Robert, who was 18 months old and sitting between them in the high chair Cyrus had built, looked from one parent to the other with the expression of a person who knows something is happening but is not yet sure what. The second child was a girl, born in July of 1881, in the same cabin that now had a third room and a proper front porch and a peach orchard starting on the northwest ridge. The trees still too young to fruit but growing well, 3 years planted and already past Cyrus's knee. They named her Annie, after no one in particular, but because it was a name both of them simply liked, clean and strong, and her full name was Annie Rose Prescott, the rose being for no one either but for the yellow rosebush that Catherine had planted at the corner of the porch in the spring, and that had bloomed that summer in the most extravagant possible way, which had seemed like a good omen. Annie Rose Prescott arrived in the world with a volume and insistence that immediately distinguished her from her quiet, observing older brother, and the combination of them was exactly the combination of a household that was fully alive. The thoughtful boy and the fierce girl, both of them with their mother's dark hair, and some combination of their parents' features that was entirely their own. The general store continued to flourish. In 1882, Catherine made the decision to expand the inventory to include a broader selection of dry goods and a small lending library of books, which last was considered eccentric by several Redrock residents and enthusiastically embraced by others. The lending library brought people into the store who might not otherwise have come, and some of them became regular customers, and some of them became something approaching friends. The store, which had once been the center of Redrock's daily commerce under Robert Langston's warm and financially haphazard management, became, under his daughter's management, both the commercial center and a kind of gathering place, honest and well-run and welcoming, the place you could come for a pound of salt and end up staying an hour talking about the books on the lending shelf. Cyrus's land produced well through the early 1880s. The longhorn herd grew steadily. The winter wheat was reliable. The kitchen garden fed them generously through the summers, and Catherine's preserved vegetables lined the cellar in satisfying rows through the winters. The peach orchard on the Northwest Ridge first fruited in 1883, and the yield that first year was modest but real, and Catherine made preserves from it that she sold at the store, labeled in her precise handwriting as Prescott's Ridge Peach Preserve, and sold out completely within a week. On a Sunday in October of 1883, 5 years after the night Cyrus Prescott had walked along a fence in the dark toward a woman standing alone on the far side of a party neither of them had been wanted at, he and Catherine sat on the porch of the cabin as the evening came down. Robert was 4 years old and asleep inside, worn out from a day of following Cyrus along the fence lines on his short legs, asking the questions that 4-year-olds ask, most of which are impossible to fully answer and all of which are worth trying. Annie Rose, 2 years old, was in Catherine's lap, also asleep, her dark head against her mother's shoulder, her small hands open and loose the way sleeping children's hands are. The evening was exactly the same quality as that October evening 5 years before, the same cool sweetness in the air, the same enormous sky filling slowly with stars, the same smell of dry grass and wood smoke. "Do you know what day it is?" Catherine said. He looked at her. "It's the 5th anniversary of the Caldwell Harvest Social," she said. Her eyes were on the sky, but her mouth held a slight curve. "Is it?" he said. "5 years ago tonight, you walked along a fence in the dark," she said, "toward a woman you had never met who was standing by herself on the other side of it. She was the best thing on that side of the fence," he said. Catherine looked at him then, and her expression was the one she kept mostly for him, the one that had nothing careful or reserved about it, the one that was all the way open. He had earned this expression over 5 years of steady love and patient presence, and it was, he thought, the finest thing he had ever been given access to. "I was thinking about that evening," she said softly. "About standing there listening to the fiddle music and being certain that nobody was going to come, and then you came. I almost didn't," he said. "I'd about convinced myself it was no business of mine to be there." "What changed your mind?" He thought about it honestly. "The music," he said, "and you, standing there the same way I was standing there, wanting to be warm and being outside the warmth. I recognized it." She was quiet for a moment. Annie Rose made a small sound in her sleep and settled deeper against her mother's shoulder. "You know what I thought when I first saw you walk along that fence," she said. "What?" "I thought, there's a man who knows exactly how it feels to not be invited somewhere," she said. "And I thought that any man who would walk along the outside of a fence toward a woman standing alone rather than just going home was worth talking to." "I'm glad you talked to me," he said. "So am I," she said. She looked back at the sky, and the stars were fully out now, the great blaze of the Texas night above them. "I was so certain I had made my peace with alone." "You said that once before," he said. "On our wedding evening. And I'll say it as many times as necessary," she said, "because it still strikes me as remarkable. I had organized the whole thing so carefully. I had accounted for every contingency. And then you walked along a fence and ruined all my calculations." He laughed, and she laughed, and the sound of it went out into the October night and over the fields where the season's last wheat stood pale in the dark, and down the slope to the creek that was running steady and clear, and up the ridge where the young peach trees were already going into their winter sleep, dreaming, perhaps, of the spring. "What calculations shall you make now?" he asked. She looked at their son sleeping inside, their daughter sleeping in her arms, the land spread out in the dark beyond the porch, the store in town that was running clean and honest and growing, the life that had been built from 40 rocky acres, and a chance meeting at the edge of a party. "No more calculations," she said. She settled Annie Rose more comfortably against her shoulder. "I find I trust the direction we're moving in." He reached over and took her free hand, the same way he had taken it that first December by the creek, the same way he had taken it at the fence when she first stepped through to his side, the same way he always took it, without ceremony, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, which by now it was. She leaned her head against his shoulder. The night went on, full of stars and frogs and the good smell of the land in October, and the lamp inside the cabin made a warm square of light in the darkness, and the ridge stood dark above them against the sky, and somewhere in the Redrock direction, perhaps at the Caldwell farm, perhaps somewhere else, a fiddle was playing. Carried on the still night air all the way to the porch of the Prescott cabin, where two people who had once stood on opposite sides of a fence in the dark sat together in the warmth they had made, and the music came to them the same way it had 5 years ago, sweet and clear and entirely theirs. They stayed on the porch until the stars were at their highest and the night was deep and cool, and then Catherine carried Annie Rose inside and Cyrus followed, and the cabin door closed behind them, and the lamp burned soft through the window, and the land lay quiet and good under the October sky, and everything that had needed to be built was built, and everything that had needed to be resolved was resolved, and the only thing ahead of Cyrus and Catherine Prescott was more of the same, more seasons on the land. More Saturday mornings with coffee on the steps, more children perhaps, more years of the store and the herd and the peach orchard on the ridge, more of the specific, ordinary, extraordinary miracle of a life built beside a person who knows you fully and chooses you anyway. The fence at the Caldwell property still stood, the split-rail fence where two uninvited people had once found each other in the dark. Neither Cyrus nor Catherine had been back to that particular fence since that night. They did not need to. They carried it with them, the memory of it, the meaning of it, the October evening when the music played and nobody came, and then somebody did, and everything that had been standing separate and outside came together and stayed. They had not been invited to the social. She had stood alone while others danced. He had walked along a fence in the dark, toward a woman he did not yet know. And from that fence, from that first careful handshake and that stumbling almost dance in the tall, dry grass, they had built the whole thing. The 40 acres and the store, the debts paid and the land settled, the well and the orchard and the kitchen garden, the children sleeping inside with their dark hair and their open hands, the friendship of an old man at a smithy and a hotel keeper who wept at weddings, the small-town stubbornness overcome by nothing more than consistent truth, and the love itself, the particular love of two people who had each made peace with alone, and then found, astonishingly and gratefully, that they preferred something else entirely. The lamp in the window burned. The stars burned over the Texas land, and somewhere on the ridge in the dark between the young peach trees, the October wind moved through the branches with a sound like distant music, soft and steady and entirely sufficient.